Not literally, like, I don't know, like about an hour or two ago, before I went to bed, I watched a video where doren was attempting to address TJ, the amazing atheist, and it blew me away, because, I mean, I realized that not a lot of people understand what the hell Marxism is anymore, terminology-wise. They just use the word to, basically attack people. You're such a, they don't even know the word mean, what those words mean anymore. And it's been going on for so long that it's literally, that everything, has gotten to the point in which it's just painful to watch these people prattle on and on and on. So, he goes on, and instead of actually addressing the points that TJ makes, he raises this point, which is that Lenin knew Benito Mussolini, and therefore, since they knew each other, that everything should, be completely, that since Benito Mussolini, knew Lenin, that somehow or another it amounts to this, to this idea that somehow Benito Mussolini and fascism was a form of socialism, just because of the fact that Benito Mussolini was, a socialist. And Benito Mussolini, over the course of his lifetime, went from socialism. He was the editor of Avanti, a socialist newspaper, to the leader of a new political movement called Fascism. After fasces, the symbol of bound sticks, used as a totem for power in ancient Rome, Mussolini came to power after the March on Rome in 1922. He was appointed by the Prime Minister King Victor Emmanuel. In 1932, Mussolini wrote, with the help of one of his Giovanni, I'm not going to try to pronounce that last word, an entry for the Italian Encyclopedia on the definition of fascism. And let's leave aside, there's two things that I want to point out here. Instead of actually defining his terms and dealing with the argument, he tries to raise this irrelevant point, which is that they knew each other, which basically doesn't rule out the possibility that Mussolini might have known Lenin at one point in his life and come to a completely different point of view. But it also doesn't actually address this, which is, a criticism that actually contrasts the views of Marx and Lenin. Which is what my point was earlier. If you want something, a lot more clear than what I was putting forward shortly before I went to bed. And what gets me is that there's this phrase that just, it stands out, no matter what is said, or no matter what diatribe, he basically, tries to put forward there, but no matter what comes out of his mouth, you have this big statement that's issued right here, which is that fascism is the complete opposite of Marxian socialism, and it's completely, antithetical and hostile to the notion of the materialist conception of history throughout human, civilization. But there are some points that I want to get at and address here. First and foremost, when it comes to, legitimate, dogma and legitimate, definitions of the terminology, if you're going to look at, a country like Russia, guess what? Not communist. Sorry. You look at a country like China, not communist. Sorry. These countries can call themselves whatever they want. However, the point remains that if that's the case, then and you want to play that way, and you want to play by those those terms, then I can, in all legitimate fairness, call the People's Democratic Republic of North Korea a republic and attack the Republican Party for being Republican, and Republicanism is therefore a dictatorship because of the fact that the People's Republic of Korea was a republic, and it's completely fair game. The problem that I'm feeling and arriving at here is that I do not and really believe that Leninism was a legitimate form anymore. I believe fundamentally that Karl Marx was massively ahead of his time when, he released the papers that he did, and what happened was a lot of people got their hands on his writings, and almost from the very moment that it was written, started trying to skip almost all of the steps in historical materialism and skip right to the communism part. Because there was a whole theory about how the future was supposed to develop and how things would probably go, and the core of society that Marx saw things going down, and it necessarily, historical materialism included capitalism as one of the steps. Now, we can all quibble over whether Russia was capitalist or feudalist, and whether China were capitalist or feudalist, but even if they were capitalist, they were in the very early stages of it. There isn't a lot, and there wasn't a lot of development, in terms of industry to speak of that would have taken place in either of those countries. Therefore, you can sort of see exactly why a lot of the brutality started to take place in those countries, because their leaders decided to basically skip the massive development of industry that capitalism was and try to skip past all of those intermediary steps and skip straight to this sort of class struggle that, skips socialism all the way into communism. So what you had were, countries that succeeded at absolutely none of those things. In fact, what ended up taking place, in Russia and China would be more like the state ended up taking on the role of the capitalist, and the attempts of the Vanguard Party, that they attempted to form in our countries ended up basically taking on the role of the capitalist oppressor that we now complain about, elsewhere. So, instead of being oppressed by this rich, bourgeois sort of person who was, who had a ton of money and exploited more or less not the dire situation and the economic upheaval that the people found themselves in. You had this instead. You had the state doing it instead. And you have this big term, which is, being put forward by Benito Mussolini, whether Benito Mussolini knew Lenin or not. He's basically saying fascism is the complete opposite of Marxian socialism. Therefore, trying to say that fascism is in some way a form of socialism or Marxism or any of that is completely invalid. Now, we can address, finally, the Nazi Party and the fact that they were the National Socialist Germans Workers' Party also a red herring, because just because they call themselves socialists doesn't mean that they actually achieve that. Now, I'm aware to many people they actually think the terminology, when it comes to this, they mean states control the means of production. And if you have the state trying to control the means of production, then you've achieved your revolution. But that's not what it was about. Fundamentally speaking, these philosophies were about the workers, and the workers were at the core of all of it. In fact, Marxism was never a philosophy that was, as it's been painted, a philosophy of the lazy. It was never a philosophy of people that were not intending to work or put forward productive labor at all. It was more like a philosophy that was being proposed as to the terms under which labor would take place. and the organization under which labor would actually organize itself. So this was a much more the ground up, rather than a top-down way of labor organizing itself. And what did it actually say? Well, you can look at in order to really find a good definition of the term, you have to actually go towards Trotsky. You actually have to go all the way to Trotsky, which would have been a much more apt definition. And this is basically being put forward by the German left opposition, and answering your question, and it's basically the workers' control of production. So if you have a country in which the state is demonstrating control of the means of production, but the workers in this country, but it cannot be demonstrated to be democratic, the workers really don't have a lot of power over the state, and the state doesn't really basically consider itself just an arm of big labor and nothing more, then you're not looking at a country in which you could legitimately call it communist or socialist or any of those terms, because what it always was and always will be is workers' control of production. So they were basically trying to put forward democratic workplaces that didn't really have a boss, more or less not. Everything was organized on the principle of workplace democracy instead. And if you want to find institutions that actually work under this terminology, you'd look no further than the credit union. So if you want to tell me that it's a wonderful philosophy that doesn't work, that works wonderfully on paper, it doesn't work in reality, I direct your attention because of the fact that you have narrowed the definition to states, even though states, it doesn't need to be states, and you want me to point to a country in which socialism has worked as an organizing principle. I can't point to a country, but I can point to corporations. The Mondragon Corporation, the credit unions. Just to name one credit union here, On Point Credit Union, the library. All of these institutions run on the principle of the workers. But we're not even going to get into, what Benito Mussolini is saying about it, because we can just basically contrast the views of Marx and Lenin to show how much of, a straw man, and an attempt to attack a red herring fallacy that this was. Lenin stood for state capitalism and argued that a socialist democracy is in no way inconsistent with the rule and dictatorship of one person. Basically, this makes him, was Lenin a Marxist? Marx and his co-worker consistently argued that socialism or communism, they used the term interchangeably, could only evolve out of the political and economic circumstances created by a fully developed capitalism. In other words, production would have to be expanded within capitalism to the point where the potential existed to allow for each to take according to their need. In turn, the objective condition would have created the basis for a socialist, conscious majority willing to contribute to their physical, mental, voluntary skills voluntarily to the production and distribution of society's need. With the extension of the suffrage, Marx claimed in 1982 that the workers might now achieve power in leading the countries of capitalism by peaceful means. Given the fact that socialism will be based on the widest possible human cooperation, it need hardly be said that Marx consistently emphasized that its achievements had to be the work of the majority. Again, given the understanding of the nature of the socialist society, Marx and Engels saw socialism essentially in world terms, a global alternative to a system of global capitalism. In the very first sentence of his monumental work, Capital, Marx wrote that the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as a vast accumulation of commodities. He then went on to define the nature of commodity in economic terms as an item of real or imagined wealth produced for the sale in a market with a view to profit. Marx claims that the wage system was quintessentially an instrument of capitalist exploitation of the working class. He urged workers to remove their banners from the conservative slogan of a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, and to inscribe instead abolition of the wage systems. Throughout his writings, he repeats in different forms the admission that wage, labor, and capital are two sides of the same coin. Marx considered that nationalization could be a means of accelerating the development of capitalism, but did not support nationalism as such. On the contrary, he argued that the state became involved in taking over the areas of production. The more it became involved in taking over the areas of production, the more it became the national capitalist. Marx saw the state as the executive community of the ruling class. In a socialist society, he affirmed that the state, as the government of the people, would give way to a simple democratic administration of things. Marx's version of a socialist society can be fairly summed up as a worldwide system of social organization based on the common ownership of the democratic control of the means and instruments for producing and distributing wealth by and in the interest of the whole community. Now, I want you to contrast that to your fundamental understanding of things that says that the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany was somehow socialist in any way. I contend that it wasn't, because I contend that nationalism, at its very core, is diametrically and necessarily opposed to socialism. It's physically and philosophically impossible to be socialist and nationalist at the same time. Anybody who claims to be this is a charlatan, a demagogue, and a fraudster. They don't mix, and they cannot mix. Therefore, any genuinely Marxist philosophy is at its core worldwide and international. There can be no nations under Marxism. None. You need look only at the song that was put forward by John Lennon, Imagine There's No Countries, to understand exactly what they're talking about. In other words, a universal, classless, wageless, and moneyless society wherein human beings would voluntarily contribute in accordance with their mental and physical abilities to the production and the distributions of their society, and in which everyone would have equal access to their needs. Lenin's distortions come in. The post-Tsarist Russia was a backwards, poorly developed, and largely feudal country where the industrial proletariat was a relatively small minority. To suggest that Russia could undergo a socialist revolution, as Lenin did in 1917, is a complete denial of the Marxist view of history. Indeed, according to the views of the Bolshevik coup, the Socialist Standard, an official organ of the Socialist Party of Great Britain, wrote, "In this huge mass of people, numbering about 160 million, spread over 8.5 square miles, ready for socialism? Are they? Are the hunters of the north, struggling peasant proprietors of the south, the agricultural wage slaves in the central provinces, and the wage slaves of the towns convinced the necessity for and equipped with a knowledgeable rescue for the establishment of the social ownership of the means of life? Unless a mental revolution such as the world has never seen before has taken place, or an economic change immensely more rapidly than history has ever recorded, the answer is unequivocally, they state outright, no." August 1918. Lenin persistently rejected the view that the working class was capable of achieving socialism without leaders. He argued that the trade union consciousness represented the peak of working class consciousness. Socialism, he affirmed, would be achieved by a band of revolutionaries at the head of the discontented but non-socialist conscious working class. The Bolshevik revolution, quote unquote, quote, revolution, unquote, was a classic example of Lenin's thinking. In fact, it was a coup d'etat carried out by professional revolutionaries based on the populist slogan, quote, peace, land, and bread, unquote. Socialism was not on offer, nor could it have been inside Russia. It's true that Lenin and his Bolsheviks wrongly thought that the Russian coup would spark millions of similar revolts in Western Europe, and especially in Germany. Not only was this a monumental political error, but it was based on Lenin's erroneous perception of socialism and his belief that the distorted conceptions could be imposed upon the working class of Western Europe, generally better politically organized and more sophisticated than the people of Russia. Probably for practical purposes, since no other course was open to them, Lenin and the Bolsheviks could not accept the Marxist view that commodity production was an identifying feature of capitalism, and what he's implying is that it doesn't matter. Commodity production for the sake of profit is a feature of capitalism, and it applies even if it's done by the state instead. Following the Bolshevik seizure of power, the production of wealth in the form of commodities was the only option open to the misnamed Communist Party. Commodity production has continued and was an accepted feature of life in, quote, communist, unquote, Russia, just as it is today following the demise of state capitalism in the Russian Empire. Back in 1908, Stalin, in a pamphlet, Socialism or Anarchism, argued that the Marxian view that the, quote, future society will be wageless, classless, and moneyless, except in power the Bolsheviks, the Marxian view that the future would be wageless, classless, moneyless, except in power the Bolsheviks proliferated the wage system, making it an accepted feature of Russian life. Wage differentials, too, were frequently greater than those obtaining in Western society. Surplus value, from which the capitalist society derives its income in the form of profit, rent, and interest, became the basis of bloated lifestyles for the bureaucracy. A contrasting feature of state capitalism and, quote, private, unquote, capitalism is that in the latter, the beneficiaries of the exploitation of labor derive their wealth and privilege from direct ownership of capital, whereas in the former, wealth and privileges were the benefits of political power. There's a wide chasm between the views of Marx and those of Lenin and their understanding of the nature of socialism, of how it would be achieved in the matter of its administration. Marx sees socialism as the abolition of ownership implied in the term common ownership. His vision is stateless, classless, and money society, in which by nature could only come to fruition when a conscious majority wanted it, and wherein the affairs of the human family could be democratically administered. A form of social organization in which people would voluntarily contribute their skills and abilities in exchange for freedom of living, in a society that guarantees their needs, wherein the poverty, repression, and violence of capitalism would have no place. Lenin's simple definition of socialism is set out in his then pending catastrophe and how to combat it. September 1917, socialism is merely the state capitalist monopoly which is made to serve the whole people. Lenin knew that he was introducing a new definition of socialism. Here it was not to be found in Marx, but claimed that there were two stages after capitalism. Socialism, his new definition, and communism. What Marxists had always understood by socialism was a stateless, classless, moneyless, and wageless society. However, so new was this definition that the other Bolshevik publications of the same period argued that socialism is the highest form of social organization that mankind can achieve. Marx would obviously have concurred with the latter claim, as has been shown, would have rejected completely the suggestion that socialism had anything to do with nationalization or that could be established over the heads of the working class. Obviously, Lenin was being consistent with his nationalization theory when, in Left-Wing Childishness, May 1918, he proclaimed the need for state capitalism. It is true, of course, that the situation in Russia left the Bolsheviks no alternative to the development of capitalism under the aegis of the state. The fact is, however, that the concept of state capitalism is wholly consistent with Lenin's misunderstanding of the nature of socialism. State capitalism achieved a permanent place in the Russian economy, and the Communist Party propaganda exported it as being consistent with the views of Marx. The contrast between Marx and Lenin is demonstrated most strikingly in Lenin's view of the nature and role of the state, whereas Marx saw the state as the feature of class society that would be used, a politically conscious working class, to bring about the transfer of power and then to be abolished. Lenin saw the state as a permanent and vital part of what he perceived as socialism, relegating Marx's abolition of the state to the dim and distant future in communism, while in the meantime the state had to be strengthened. The Russian state, the coercive arm, became a huge, brutal dictatorship under Lenin, who set the scene for the entry of the dictator, Stalin. Lenin approved a dictatorship even of a single person was spelled out clearly in a speech he made on economic reconstruction on the 31st of March 1920. We are now repeating what was approved by the Centralisi 2 years ago, namely that the Soviet socialist democracy is in no way inconsistent with the rule and the dictatorship of one person, that the will of a class is best realized by a dictator who sometimes will accomplish more by himself and frequently more needed. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 17, page 86, the first Russian edition, period. This statement alone should be enough to convince any impartial student of Marxism that there was no meeting of the minds between Marx and Lenin at all. Russia, after the Bolshevik coup and the establishment of state capitalism, became a brutal totalitarian dictatorship. The fact is that the new working class exploited the working class, that the ruling class exploited the working class through its political power instead of economic power, meant that the workers were denied the protection of independent organizations such as trade unions and political organizations. The Western media, particularly oblivious to the implications of communism, even as defined sometimes in their dictionaries, frequently drew attention to the poverty of the Russian workers. Conversely, and correctly, it also drew the attention to the privileged and opulent lifestyles of the, quote, communist, unquote, bosses. The same media, apparently without any sense of contradiction, was telling the public that the Western world was that what the, quote, communist, unquote, controlled media were telling the workers of the Russian Empire. The Russia represented the Marxian concept of a, quote, classless, unquote, society. The litmus test of the existence of, quote, communism for Western journalists was the recognition of the claim that by a state or political power that it was either, quote, socialist or, quote, communist. Similar claims by such states and parties to be, quote, democratic was never given the slightest credibility. And it might be argued that those who rejected the, quote, democratic claim knew a little about democracy, wherein they knew nothing about whatsoever about socialism. The contradiction between the views of Marx and Lenin set out above relate to fundamental issues. Inevitably, they form the basis for numerous other conflicts of opinions between Marxism and Leninism. In light of these basic contradictions, it's absurd and dishonest to claim that there is any compatibility between Marx's concept of a free, democratic, socialist society and the brutal state capitalism espoused by Lenin. Journalists, especially, which should be in no doubt about the interest that they serve when they promulgate the lie that Marxism or socialism exist anywhere in the world. Period. So, for Lee Doren, the drone, more or less not to imply that Lenin knew Mussolini, therefore, since Lenin knew Mussolini, and Mussolini espoused the dogmas of fascism, that fascism is somehow a form of socialism, is kind of akin to saying, as I stated, that whales are mammals, whales live in the sea, therefore all mammals live in the sea. Basically, he has a bunch of people who all defer to Lenin to call themselves Marxist or socialist. And the thing is that Lenin was never a Marxist. He fundamentally contrasted and disagreed with and contradicted Marx. So if your claim up here is that Lenin knew that, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. They could know each other all they want, but neither of them were ever socialist. Not only that, but let's look again at what it said. Fascism is the complete opposite of Marxian socialism. This is straight out of him. The materialist conception of history and civilization that can be explained simply through the conflict of interest among various social groups and in the change and development by the means of production. Fascism now always believes in holiness and heroism, that is to say, that in actions influenced by no economic motive, direct or indirect. It fundamentally, he didn't even attempt to agree with Lenin. And you can see that, Benito Mussolini, over the course of his lifetime, went from socialism. He was the editor of Vantai, a socialist newspaper, to the leadership of a new political movement called Fascism. So, as we've just demonstrated in this 30-minute debunking, which is quite extensive, you cannot concurrently be a nationalist and a Marxist. All socialists are anti-nationalist. Every single legitimate socialist is anti-nationalist. Flags are bits of colored cloth. I leave you with this.
Flags are bits of colored cloth that governments use first to shrink wrap people's brains and then as ceremonial shrouds to bury the dead. Down at the mall there's a mid-season sale. Everything's discounted. Oceans, rivers, oil, gene pools, fig wasps, flowers, childhoods, aluminium factories, phone companies, wisdom, wilderness, civil rights, ecosystems, air, all 4,600 million years of evolution. It's packed, sealed, tagged, valued, and available off the rack. No returns. As for justice, I'm told it's on offer too. You can get the best that money can buy. Donald Rumsfeld said that his mission in the war against terror was to persuade the world that Americans must be allowed to continue their way of life. When the maddened king stamps his foot, slaves tremble in their quarters. So standing here today, it's hard for me to say this, but the American way of life is simply not sustainable, because it doesn't acknowledge that there is a world beyond America. The time has come, the walrus said. Perhaps things will become worse and then better. Perhaps there's a small god up in heaven readying herself for us. Another world is not only possible, she's on her way. Maybe many of us won't be here to greet her, but on a quiet day, if I listen very carefully, I can hear her breathing.
So when you want to sit here and tell me that the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany was somehow socialist, I'm offended. Because nationalism and socialism can never march together. Socialism, at its vital, fundamental core, does not believe in countries. If you believe in them, you are not a brother with them. I do not know you. I do not recognize you as one of us. I don't see any borders. Do you? From space and from above, there are no borders. Imagine that there's no countries. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries, it isn't hard to do, nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say that I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will be as one. Imagine no possessions, I wonder if you can. No greed or hunger, a brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing the world. You may say that I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and we can live as one. That, and no less, is what socialism is. So when you try to sit here and hurl that term because other people have bastardized it and exploited it throughout history, I won't let you. The buck stops. That is the final line. Because socialism is at its vital and most essential core, fundamentally, and one of its edicts, one of the very first and necessary axioms of it. Without this, it's not a form of it, is that there are and can be no countries, no nations, no states. There can be only the world. And if you want to have a country or some little division, you can no longer call yourself a socialist. At its the notion of anti-nationalism is more, and by this I do not mean opposed to the country you live in and in favor of some other country. I mean opposed to the very abstract notion of nationalism and deeply suspicious of it on every country on the planet. No countries at all. If you are not an anti-nationalist, how you can call yourself in any way, light or shape, or point to somebody and call them, and they are not an anti-nationalist, and call them a socialist is beyond me. Because socialists, in my conception, fundamentally do not believe in countries. They don't believe in nations. The Germans merely stole the term, corrupted it, and perverted it. That's what they always do. It's what demagogues do.